guys, it is officially March. That means it's time for my February reading wrap-up. I read 5 books this month. 4 were for my TBR, so I think I did an okay job, considering. I didn't read much this month, at least for me. I tend to read more like 10 books a month usually. I was studying for the bar this month, and I actually took the bar at the end of February, so my reading was definitely impacted by that. Just everyone, please pray for me that I fucking pass the bar this time, because I might have screwed it up because I was working full-time, but we're not going to talk about that. Everything's fine. Anyway, let's get on to the books. The first book that I read in February was The Reformatory by Tananarive Due. This book was horrific and heartbreaking, but I think it's an important read. So essentially you're following 2 siblings, Gloria and Robbie. They were kind of left to fend for themselves in Jim Crow South after their mother died and their father had to flee because he was kind of organizing Black people and was, as a result of that, falsely accused of a crime, so he had to flee to the north. Then one day while walking to school, Gloria is approached by this absolute asshole white boy who, is making moves on her, and Robbie kicks him, and as a result of that kick, he is sent to a reformatory for 6 months. The book then follows Robbie's experience in the reformatory where ghosts roam and where abuse is the norm, as well as Gloria's experience trying to get him out. When reading the acknowledgements of this book, I found out that the story was inspired by one of the author's family members who actually spent time in and died in a reformatory in the South. So she kind of wrote the book as a way to spread knowledge about these places, these terrible, terrible places. And I just think that really highlights the book's importance because the horror in this novel isn't really the ghost, it's racism. This book is scary in the same way that reading a book about the Holocaust is scary, where it just, really you're forced to confront the horrors that people are capable of. Yeah, the ghosts are the more typical, horror element here, which is probably, what makes this book be classified as horror. But I think the scariest part of this entire book is when Gloria and her family members are huddled in a house, hiding from the windows because the KKK is surrounding her house. And that's a very real experience that Black people in the South had. Those moments were the absolute most terrifying of the book, hands down. I read a couple of negative reviews of this on Goodreads that are saying the book is too long, particularly that Gloria's chapter should have been cut, and I just have to say I really, really disagree with that. I think Gloria's chapters are just as important as Robbie's chapters because they show her trying to go through the correct legal processes to get him out. She goes to the judge, she gets a lawyer from the NAACP involved, and as a result of that, her house is surrounded by the KKK. She has to hide from the police because they're trying to use her as bait to get her father come back to the South so that they can kill him. And I think, that's so important because it shows how racism was intertwined with these supposed channels of justice. It shows that racism wasn't just at the reformatory, but it was in all aspects of life. It still is. I'm not saying it's in the past. Ooh, I fell. I stepped on something. Anyway, I'm not saying it's in the past. It obviously still is, but this is really about, Jim Crow South and how, pervasive racism was during then. I also really liked that their father was someone who's advocating for Black power and had to face the consequences of that as well. And when I say consequences, I'm not saying something that, makes sense or is right. It's just kind of, what happened back then, and oftentimes today when you're advocating for Black power and Black equality. He was falsely accused of a crime. He had to flee the South and they flee his family. He couldn't be with his kids. And the book really showed the effect that that had on him and his family. So it, really goes to show, it's not that Black people weren't fighting back, it's just that the systems made it so impossible for them to do anything. So overall, I think this book, it just shares a really important story. I don't want to say that I enjoyed it, because it's a very heavy book, but I would recommend it. And I think I've heard to say this already, but I gave it 4 stars. Next, I picked up The Warm Hands of Ghosts by Katherine Arden. I was so excited about this book because I really loved Katherine Arden's, I think it's the Winter Night trilogy. I think that's the name of the trilogy. I loved it, and I've been so excited to see whatever she does next. So this book follows Laura, who was a combat nurse during World War I. Well, she still is, because World War I is still happening in this book. But basically, she was originally a combat nurse, and then she got sent back to Canada after she was injured. Her brother is a soldier in the war, and she receives news that her brother has gone missing. But the news is, kind of suspicious, because they send back his articles of clothing and, his dog tag to her. So she's kind of like, first of all, how did you get this stuff if he was missing? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And they say that he's presumed dead, but again, if he's missing and dead, how did you get his clothing? And she also hears from a close friend something kind of suspicious that makes her suspect that her brother might not be dead. So when she makes a friend in Canada who has a hospital on the front line, she immediately signs up with her. And she goes to the front lines and is trying to find her brother. And at the same time, there's like some fantastical elements going on that are also very spooky. Now, I've read like quite a bit of World War II books, so even though this book focuses on World War I instead, I didn't really think it would stick out to me that much, just because, I don't know, like World War II is obviously a very different war than World War I, but I feel like all war books kind of blend together at some point. But I do have to say that this is one of the most unique stories set during a war that I've ever read. Arden does just a brilliant job setting the atmosphere of this book. Like right from the beginning, from the explosion in Halifax, things are violent and haunted. Then she takes you out on the front lines and shows the brutal reality of war. And I actually think I haven't read any books set on the front lines of a war before. And I think she just did a really great job showing obviously how like brutal and violent and terrible that is. I just think overall the story was like very brutal and unflinching, if that makes sense. I also just love the mysterious, like fantastical elements of this. And obviously I can't say too much about that without spoiling anything, but they were just so spooky and I thought it was great. I love that she added just a touch of fantasy in there, but even though it is fantasy, it still felt so realistic. Like the fantastical elements, obviously the war felt realistic. I just really enjoyed this book. I gave this book 4 stars. Then, after that, I picked up Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. This book follows a young boy named Demon Copperhead who is growing up in Appalachia, and his mother is an addict, and she overdoses one day and is taken to the hospital, and as a result, he has to go into foster care while she's seeking rehab. But that's really just the beginning of the story. Like, so much happens in this book. I mean, it's a beefy book, so much has to happen. But, like, that just scratches the surface of the story. I don't want to share more than that because I don't want to spoil anything. But Kingsolver really delves into just so many issues, like generational poverty, addiction, the fault of the foster care system, like, among others. She's dealing with so much stuff in here. I took my time reading this. Like, I think it took me about a week, which for me is a long time to read a book, but that's really no fault of the book itself. It was just, again, studying for the bar and suffering generally. I didn't have much time for reading, even though I was enjoying the book, and once I got into it, I was really into it. Like, towards the end, I just could not put it down. And that isn't to say that it's not a challenging read, because Kingsolver really jammed in every depressing thing she could think of into this book. And I actually read a lot of, like, people complaining on Goodreads that this book is kind of stereotyping Appalachia because of that. And I think that is a well-deserved critique, but I also think at the same time, like, Kingsolver is from this community. Like, she lives in Appalachia, she grew up there, and she's presumably seen many of these issues firsthand. And, like, these are issues that are prevalent in Appalachia, like addiction, particularly, through no fault of their own, as she makes the point in this book. Like, personally, I just ultimately feel like these issues are relevant to the region, and I think that she handles them with a lot of care. Like, again, she is jamming every depressing thing possible into this book, and maybe she is furthering stereotypes for some people, honestly. I don't feel like it's my place to really debate that as someone who doesn't live in Appalachia, but I do think that this novel, as dark as it could be, was so full of love and hope, and I feel like Kingsolver is really writing for these people living in Appalachia, going through the same issues that Demon Copperhead was going through, and showing them how they can still come out at the end, and how things can still improve and life can get better. They just have to fight for it. And I think she was really writing for those people to, like, prove to them that hope is, like, realistic. And it does say at the end of the book that those are the people she was writing for. So that's kind of my take on that. Ultimately, I think this is an important book, and I just love so many of the points she made here. I love how she went into the history of Appalachia, how, like, even though Virginia was part of the Confederacy, the people in Appalachia actually fought back against the Confederates, which is something I didn't know. I didn't know where the term red shirt had come from. No, not red shirt. I didn't know where the term redneck had come from, and learning that was so eye-opening to me and so, like, inspiring. I also liked how she delved into, like, how the term hillbilly and that stereotype is so hurtful for those people. And I lastly really loved how she talked about how the poverty and addiction that's rampant in Appalachia was intentional and not the fault of the people there. She talks about how, like, the producers of OxyContin specifically targeted that area because they knew they could make money there. And she also, in addition to that, talks about how there's been all these lawsuits against, like, the people who have produced Oxy, but none of that money has gone back into helping these people that are most affected. I just think so many good points were made by this book. I did really enjoy it. I love my addition too, guys. I think it's so cute with the rainbows. And I would highly recommend this book. I gave it 3 stars, I believe. I gave it 4 stars. Ultimately, it's a hard book, but I think it's a good one. Next, I picked up 10 Minutes, 38 Seconds in the Strange World by Elif Shafak. This book has a really interesting premise. So essentially, at the beginning of the novel, our main character is murdered. And the beginning of the book follows the 10 minutes and 38 seconds that her brain is still, like, operating after her death before she fully loses consciousness or something like that. And throughout this time, she's remembering her life leading up to her death. And then after that, the story takes a turn and it follows her close friends and their reactions to her death. The first thing I noticed about this book was that the writing was beautiful. I think there's no denying that. Especially shines in the first half of the novel where she's, like, recounting her life. But I do think there's just something about this book that didn't really work for me. I think, like, I get what she was trying to do in the beginning, where she was just trying to give glimpses of Layla's life, but it just didn't really work for me, even though I found that part to be more compelling than the second part. The second part is told more like a typical novel, like, linearly. I don't think I said that word right, but I'm just going to breeze past that, which is really more my speed. But again, I found the first half more compelling, but again, like, I just couldn't fully get into it because it's just, like, these glimpses of her life and not, like, the full story. I just felt like I wasn't really connecting to the story like I wanted to, but I'm definitely in the minority here because on Goodreads, everyone is raving about this book, and I think there's a lot of reasons to rave about this book. Again, the writing is beautiful. There's an immense showing of diversity here, which I think is amazing. Like each of her friends is representing, like, a minority group in some way. And I found that to be really refreshing, actually. I saw some people complaining about that as well. I saw some people saying that she was, like, trying to jam-pack diversity into there. But I just feel like it felt really natural. It didn't feel like that to me. And I thought it was really refreshing to read a book where the characters are so diverse. Because it's just not something that you come upon very often. I try to come upon it in my books. I try to read more diversely. But considering, like, this wasn't... Oh my god, I'm bleeding. I forget what I was saying. Anyway, this is a diverse book, and I liked that about it. And overall, I did like this book. I just didn't, like, connect to it like I wanted to, and I gave it 3 stars. So I would still recommend it, especially if the premise sounds interesting to you. And then the last book I read in the month of February was Revolutionary Feminisms. This is a series of conversations with feminist Marxists for the most part. And I have to say, the main takeaway that I got from this book is that this is not for people who are beginners in academic feminism, like I am. So this was not a book for me. I just think I should make that clear right off the bat. Like, the fact that I'm not really well versed in that, like, I didn't study feminism in school. I studied poli-sci, and, like, yeah, I read some feminist texts, but it wasn't like I was a woman and gender studies major, which I think, like, if you were one, then maybe this book would make more sense to you. I had a lot of hard time, like, understanding a lot of what was being said in this book, because it goes into a conversation with these interviewees, and it operates off of the assumption that, like, you already are familiar with all of their work and you can, like, understand in-depth conversations about it, because they don't really well define the terms they're talking about or, like, their specific theories. They might, like, define it in, like, 1 sentence, and the whole rest of the, like, 20 pages of the interview is them going into, like, some niche question about their academic theory. Like, they were just constantly throwing out academic terminology, and I think that makes sense for the format, because it's ultimately, like, a conversation with people who know what they're talking about, but as someone who didn't know what they were talking about, very hard to follow. And I think this would have benefited from being a more introductory text and for making it more accessible, because, like, how many people are in this book? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They interviewed 10 people in this book. And I just think the people who know all 10 of these people's theories very well, that's not a big portion of the population. Like, I don't think many people will know all of this, if that makes sense. So, like, I really did find myself being disappointed by this book just because I couldn't really understand a lot of it. I was doing my best, but I was holding on by a thread. I will say there's a lot of great stuff here. I really loved Angela Davis's interview, particularly because I really love talking about abolition. That's like an interest of mine. I've read some of Angela Davis's work before, so I was able to follow along. I think she also did a better job making her interview more accessible as well. I really liked how a lot of these feminisms built upon Marxism and its defects, and ultimately this book gave me a lot of academics to look into and read more about, which I really enjoyed. I'll definitely be looking into a lot of these people more. But don't come into this expecting an easy read, because it is not that. And then the last thing I do want to add is that I was really disappointed by, how do you say her name? Silvia Federici's interview. I have read, God, what's the book? Caliban the Witch. I read Caliban the Witch by her, and that is like one of the most life-changing nonfiction books I've ever read. When I make my life-changing nonfiction book video, it will be on that list, because that book is amazing. But she was making like almost anti-trans comments in this. Like, she was talking about how we shouldn't do hormone therapy for young trans people because all girls think they want to be a boy or something like that. Like she was talking about how when she was like younger, she didn't want to be a girl just because of what being a girl like stood for, which I can understand that. But I think you can still accept that, like, yeah, you weren't embracing femininity, but you also didn't see yourself as a boy. You weren't a boy, you know? It just felt transphobic. So I didn't like that, and I feel like the editors or the interviewers, I guess, could have done a better job calling her out in that. I think they were a little bit too tame with it, to be honest. So I do want to highlight that for anyone that goes into this. There are some transphobic comments, so you could probably just skip that interview if that's something that will hurt you. Overall, I gave this book 3 stars, because again, I do think there's some good stuff in here. I just wish I understood it more. And there you go. Those are all the books I read in February. Let me know what books you read down below, and I'll see you soon with another video. Goodbye!